This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I am Gilad Halpern. This is not your usual Tel Aviv Review episode. I'm merely seizing my privilege as the host to introduce you to a new initiative that you may find interesting. The Tel Aviv Review of Books is an English language quarterly magazine. It started appearing in the beginning of 2019 and it's freely accessible on tab.co.il. I am joined by my co-editors, Olga Kirschbaum, Alex Stein, and Akin Ajayi, who's joining us on Skype from London. Hello to you all.
Hello,
Hi, good morning.
Hi, Gilad.
So, Alex, it all started because, as you say, you're a bad listener.
Well, yeah, I was, I got the updates about the Tel Aviv Review podcast, and I always thought, wow, this looks really interesting. The problem is, personally, I don't like listening to podcasts. I prefer to read stuff, lots of it. And I thought this would be really interesting if I could read it. So I contacted Gilad, because I used to have a show on TLV1. I contacted Gilad. I said, Gilad, why we need to make this into a journal, into a publication. And Gilad said, fine, if you'll help me do it. And then we recruited some other people, Olga and Akin. And then earlier this year, we published our first issue. We recently published our second issue, and the third issue will be out in late September.
Olga, you joined because you felt that there was a need for an English language publication of this sort.
I did. Well, I just want to briefly discuss. It was March of 2017, I think, that I got a call from Alex where he goes, Olga, I've got an idea for you. You've got to get back to me. So I received that call and I thought, oh my God, what is he saying? And then, of course, he explains it to me. He says, now you've got to decide in the next 24 hours. And I said, okay. And I thought, so you ask me, this is to follow up on the need. I do think that there is a need for an international audience to get the richness of discussion on Israel and about Israel in the English language with access to the original language that it's written in. Because I think that either there's sort of a Hebrew world of resources, information, and there's an English world, and then there are very smaller pockets of, French language discussion on Israel, and, even small pockets of German language. But Tel Aviv Review of Books offers this unique opportunity of reaching this international audience, and at the same time giving writers who write in different languages an opportunity to write for us as well.
I also think it's important to point out and stress that the Tel Aviv Review of Books, even though it's an English language publication, and it's predominantly an Israeli publication, it is in every piece published in it is in one way or another related to Israel. We are trying to avoid, as much as we can, the diasporic outlook, which in a way the English language sort of sucks us into sometimes, but we need to be firm. And there's enough other excellent intellectual, literary publications, Jewish publications in English out there. We are trying to be something different. Akin, what is your take on the Tel Aviv Review of Books? What do you think it brings to the table? You being, I think, the most experienced literary editor of the four of us.
Experienced isn't quite the word I would use. More of I've been talking about for quite a while. But I think something that's missing from the conversation about Israel is a genuine acknowledgement and recognition of a plurality of voices, which Olga touched on already, and you have as well, in terms of a conversation often being streamlined into very, very limited lines of thinking. And certainly what I really felt energized by when you and Alex got in touch with me was the genuine opportunity to broaden the conversation, to incorporate a panoply of voices, and most importantly, to create a space where people actually talk to each other and feed from each other, hopefully, occasionally, rather than shouting at each other or over each other without actually acknowledging or integrating the diverse points of view, opinions, and orientations that define contemporary Israel. So this is something that really, really energizes me. And this is why I was really, really chuffed, delighted to be invited to be a part of this initiative.
Okay, well, can I add to that? I think also what makes the Tel Aviv Review of Books unique is that diversity here really means also irreconcilable views, that we're trying to have a platform where people are writing from perspectives and coming from perspectives that are very distant. And so it means hopefully that our readers will get a really broad spectrum of perspectives.
Yeah, there is a question that I keep hearing, and probably you as well, is what is your political line? What are you more to the left, more to the right? What's your take on the Israeli government, on Israel-diaspora relations? Alex?
Well, I think that this is something that really marks out the Tel Aviv Review of Books from a whole host of other publications where there is, esteemed publications like the London Review of Books or the New York Review of Books, produce wonderful and fascinating material, but there is a clear political line to both of those publications, and we consciously have decided to avoid that. So of the four of us, for example, I won't, we'll leave, the listeners can guess, but we have on the four of us people voting from the joint list to the Likud, and that's, I think, very important. And as well as that, we also have just a wide range of interests. That also reflects that, to broaden the conversation out beyond the realm of just kind of contemporary politics to history and to we're going to get to kind of dance, music, culture, all aspects of what touches on Israeli life. And that diversity is really important.
And also, I think the plurality of voices on politics, clearly we do not focus solely on politics and history and so-called contentious issues. We have a lot of stuff on literature, and we have original fiction, we have poetry, we have literary criticism. But when it comes to politics, I think that one of the great features, gimmicks, if you like, that we're trying to make it in the next issue as well, is the so-called dual review, DUEL review, in which we give a book or several books to two reviewers to review separately, to write two separate reviews, and those reviewers are from, say, different sides of the divide, other ends of the spectrum, however you like to call it, and they write independently two separate reviews about the same books, offering a comprehensive panorama on the issue as much as we can. Akin, yes, you wanted to say something?
Yes, I was just going to add to what you said a moment ago, which is that in terms of political orientation, personally, I would like to think of myself as politically agnostic. Well, that's not really the point. I think something that we've been able to do so far is that we've been able to draw out in detail a very, very involved consideration of a political or social or cultural issue to an extent where the reader, who may have some knowledge, may have little knowledge, or may have a very, very fixed view, is forced to actually engage with a point of view that may not necessarily reflect theirs, and to think about it and to digest it and to try to draw from it. I'm thinking, for example, of Asher Schachter's excellent essay about Israeli neoliberalism in our first issue, which certainly brought to my attention quite a few issues that I had never really considered when thinking about whether Israel is a genuinely liberalist economy. Or from a different perspective, Rachel Dazinger's very, very informative and very, very in-depth issue, article about Dror Bernstein's Mock, which was in issue 2, which, given that I'm not Jewish and I'm not religious, I don't have a background in biblical exegesis, but reading it actually brought the richness and the contextual depth that I think is often lacking in a lot of medium-length writing nowadays. And I'm hoping that this is something that allows us to not quite transcend political ideology, but at least integrate it into something that's more meaningful and more whole, more useful.
We should add for our listeners that Muck is a biblical fiction. It's basically fictionalizing the story of Prophet Jeremiah. And Rachel Danziger's piece,
putting it in present-day Jerusalem.
Yeah, and I think that Rachel Danziger's piece was excellent in really tying in the broader issue of biblical fiction and how it becomes biblical criticism. I mean, what's the interrelation between these two great traditions? And I have to say that this is my favorite piece that we've published so far. Do you have any preferences, Olga, Alex? Give our listeners an example of one of the pieces that stood out for you.
Well, I actually liked Eris Biton's poem from the first issue, The Cemetery in Lod. And I would like to add in relation to that one of the features that we offer translating authors from different languages from Hebrew, and we offer the service to translate from Russian or from French or other languages that are relevant for people who live here in Israel or who write about Israel, is that in a sense that's a very sociologically grounded way of getting diversity, because there are subcultures in Israel. There are intellectual subcultures. And I think also the interview that I did with Rebbetzin Tzipora Heller, I mean, she's a rock star in the Haredi subculture, but she's a virtual unknown, in the secular sphere here in Israel. So that's what I would add to the diversity, that there's a practical aspect that brings it out.
There's also, drawing on what you just said, there's another thing that I find very, that I really care about, is bringing also to the international audience voices or perhaps personalities in the Hebrew-speaking Israeli discourse that are relatively unknown to them. And I think that one of the pieces that I enjoyed commissioning the most was the one about Boaz Evron, who was, I think, one of the most remarkable political thinkers in Israel. He died a couple of years ago, aged 91 or 92. But I think that from the 50s to the 80s, he was kind of an unorthodox, very unusual political thinker in his engagement with Zionism. And he wasn't very well known, very known in Israel, but he wasn't very well known at all outside of Israel. And I remember speaking to several people in America and the English-speaking world who are interested in Israeli political thought, and they had a very vague notion about who Evron was and what he was all about. So bringing to the fore issues and people and ideas that are, in a way, familiar to the Israeli, intellectually leaning Israeli, but are relatively unknown for an international audience, Alex.
Yeah, and I actually think, well, on that note, I'm very excited in issue, it's going to be actually issue 4, not issue 3. We've commissioned a piece by a young writer from El-Fahim in northern Israel, in the Triangle region, on the story of Palestinian architecture over the 20th century and how it, of course, interweaves with politics. And there's, of course, much has been written on what has happened with the story of the Palestinians over the course of the 20th century. But what I think is going to be really interesting about this is it's going to zoom in on the buildings and what's happened to the buildings in different places, whether it be in Israel itself or in the West Bank, and how the what the architectural story and what's going to be happening into the future. So I think that's really important. And if you're asking my favorite piece so far was actually Akin's interview with Jessica Cohen, very prominent translator, David Grossman, among other writers, was a really kind of
and won the Man Booker Prize together with him.
Won the Man Booker Prize together with him, and for A Horse Walks Into a Bar. The punchline isn't ouch, and yeah, really in-depth look at kind of translation and the issues around it. And it was great to have it in the first issue, because this kind of issue of what does it mean, for example, to translate stuff from Hebrew to English or putting out things in different languages, and which Olga said, this is the kind of meta theme in many of the things. One of the things we're really grappling with all the time when we're putting this together.
I also wanted to add that I enjoyed being a part of the idea of coming up with an article on Israel and China. And one of the things I think the Tel Aviv Review of Books offers is Israel within an international context, above and beyond simply the conflict here in Israel. And so that was exciting to read. And we have another another series, I think, that also speaks to this international context, reading Lolita in Tel Aviv. And I enjoyed very much working with Professor Ofra Benjo, who's the specialist on Kurdish affairs and culture here in Israel, on reviewing the first English language book, Kurdish novel.
Yeah, the purpose behind reading Lolita in Tel Aviv, it is a funny slogan, but basically it's reading regional and international literature and reviewing it from an Israeli perspective.
With a focus on minority languages in the Middle East.
With a focus on minority languages. And I'm excited, hopefully, to offer for issue 4 some writing on modern Assyrian culture and also its relationship to Israel. So that's very original, I think, compared to other reviews in the approach.
Another thing that I really like about our magazine is that we're not trying to reinvent the wheel. I mean, we are trying to offer the international audience a glimpse into the Israeli culture, but we're not trying to create it out of nothing. And for this purpose, we partnered with several Hebrew language literary magazines and intellectual magazines. Unlike the Tel Aviv Review of Books that filled a void that needed filling, there are quite a few that we could choose from, which is great. And we basically choose pieces with an international appeal or an international potential. And we translate them into English. And it works beautifully because even in this technical sort of exercise, we are, merely by virtue of translating pieces from the Hebrew, regardless of the content, which adds a lot, of course, but regardless of the content, we're offering our readers a glimpse into the Israeli world of letters. Akin.
Yes, what you say is really interesting because speaking as someone who had no personal connection to Israel before I moved there 12 years ago, I'm always struck by, on the one hand, very, very strong opinions many people outside Israel have about Israel. And on the other hand, very, very limited scope of information that they draw from. And certainly in that context, what we can do is to use a word that academics use, and sometimes I feel a bit uncomfortable with, but works well, is to problematize the playground, problematize the setting, to give more context, more feeling, more engagement with the panoply of issues that make up the country we live in. And from there to have a much more nuanced and potentially more informed engagement rather than the very, very delineated and rather rigid approach that comes from the limited amount of information that appears in English about Israel.
Yeah, and I think, this ties in with the point of diversity. We talked about kind of the diversity amongst the editorial team, but in terms of our writers, we really are open to all perspectives. That was very important from the start. That we're not going to turn anyone away for being too right wing, to being too left wing, for being anti-Zionist, for being a strong neo-Zionist. Like, the requirement is this kind of seriousness of approach. We're looking to get beyond polemic. And of course, it needs to be, it's funny, it's one thing we haven't said, I think, today, is that although we do, of course, have kind of some reportage and essays and various other approaches, it's seeing Israel through books and using the book as a kind of medium to kind of make deeper points about society and getting beyond. We're not just doing, it's not book reviews, but using books to write broader essays. And I think the very nature of the book helps people, is a great tool for getting that greater depth in the
book
writing.
Is sometimes just a pretext, like the big literary reviews in the world do, and do it well. This is certainly something that we're aspiring to do. I think another aspect of this plurality, of this diversity that we're trying to put across, comes from the members of our editorial board that we haven't mentioned. Olga, mention some of them and tell us who they are.
Well, I think that we are very lucky to have an extremely accomplished editorial board, which includes rabbis like Rabbi Sharon Shalom, which includes public intellectuals like Eva Illouz, which includes academics like Professor Yossi Ben Artzi, which includes francophones like Professor Shmuel Trigano, which includes
Joshua Sobel.
Right, theater playwrights, and
Jeffrey Sachs.
Right, Jeffrey Sachs. Help me out here. I remember.
We have a couple of
we've got to be careful because we're going to accidentally miss. Full list is on the website.
But novelists and academics
Dorit
and
Rabinyan and Asaf Gavron.
Right. I think the issue that's related to that is that the world of letters is not limited to a certain type of intellectual. And I think so. It's not simply that people have a different perspective politically. It's also that they write with different genres and have, in a way, are positioned differently. So everything from philosophy to journalism to art to theater, these are all forms of letters which come with a specific outlook and way of being. And I think we can add to that in our essays. What's also unusual is that if we're writing about a community or a perspective that's maybe not, we'll call mainstream, we have a person, or we've had writers who are within that perspective. So it's not what you often see, which is a kind of academic distance. So someone who was coming from the academy looking on to a certain community with an anthropological eye. Rather, we're having these viewpoints from within the community. The interview with Rebbetzin Sephora Heller is an example of that. The essay that we had in our first issue on converts in Israel and outside of Israel is an example of that. And Janan Basul's interview in our first issue is an example of that.
With a Jaffa-based Palestinian poet who writes in Hebrew, and it was about the politics of language and the multifaceted identity of her as a writer. All right, last thoughts before we wrap up?
Well, it's been lots of fun so far, most certainly. And I'm quite heartened by the response we've had so far from the wider readership. And I'm very much looking forward to moving on with issues 3 and 4 this year. I mean, maybe we want to see this.
It will be out in September and December, inshallah.
Inshallah, yeah. Yes. We do have, do you want to say this a bit about what we've got coming up with the next 2 issues? I'm working on an essay about the creation and the maintenance of the legacy of Prime Minister Rabin as part of our ongoing series of the Prime Ministers of Israel. We have a review of a book about Jews in contemporary Iran. We have an essay about the political influence of Shas. What else do we have coming up in issue 3?
We've got the biggest Israeli gangster trial in history, the Abigail trial, and how he in prison was reading Nietzsche and Ayn Rand. And what does that say? We've got poetry. We've got a dual review on the War of Return book by Einat Wilf and the autobiography by the founder of Zochrot. So 2 books coming at the same subject from very different perspectives. And much more. We can't give it all away. We've got to keep people on no spoilers.
But as always, we have a good mix of literary criticism and essays and book reviews and fiction and non-fiction and original fiction and poetry.
And the extra.
And we have the Tel Aviv Extra, which is monthly pieces. This month we've got a short story from Chaim Watzman, and we have an interview with Evan Fallenberg on his new novel, The Parting Gift. Next month we're going to have a piece on Tel Aviv street names and an interview with Guy Stagg, who wrote a book called The Crossway. He walked all the way from Canterbury to Jerusalem.
As you do.
So, as you do. And I also just want to add something really important. I've been given permission to do this. Tel Aviv Books, we have 2 other really important principles. Number 1, that it's going to be freely available to read. And number 2, we pay our contributors. Not millions, but a fair pay for their work. In order to do that, we are reliant on the goodwill of the public. And thus far, we've managed that. But please, if you would like, we really would appreciate a donation. We have the donation pages up on our website, www.tarb.co.il. It will be greatly, greatly, greatly appreciated.
And
Absolutely.
Go and read everything. Thousands upon thousands of fascinating content.
Absolutely.
Just to give you something that you can't find elsewhere. And I think this is what we are aiming for. There's a lot in the daily press in English going on online here in Israel. I mean, I can think of at least a dozen titles that come out that provide round-the-clock updates on the news. There's a lot of academic publications on Israel. I can think of the Israel Studies Review and Israel Studies Journal, I think. There are at least two, but there are many more. But in between those two realms that have very different audiences in mind, there's little for the lay reader, as you can say, who is interested in something that's a bit more in-depth than what you get in the papers. So
we're not the Times of Israel.
We're not the Times of Israel. Read the Tel Aviv
We're
Review
not
of
the
Books.
Israel Studies Review.
Neither, and thank God for that. Okay, Akin Ajayi, Olga Kirschbaum, Alex Stein. I'm Gilad Halpern. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Gilad.
Thank you, Gilad.
Thank you.